Hello, everyone, and welcome along to episode 2 of the new vegan time tunnel. So today we're looking at this, which is the animals film. That's the DVD version, 26 years after it first came out, I believe. So in terms of the series, the idea is for week on week, we're going to hopefully put together a kind of archive of some of the most significant things that have happened in the animal advocacy movement. And so it should build up week after week and then become, an archive for people to, as it were, explore the history of our movement, which is obviously very important. Okay, without further ado then, let's go with the time tunnel. So the animals film, I suppose the first thing we could say about the animals film is that it's kind of my generation's Earthlings, I suppose. It had a really big effect when it came out. It's a film from 1981, and it was created by Victor Schonfeld and also Miriam Allure as well. And so it was a big deal, as I said, when it came out. So we're going to go through a few of the things about the film. I'm going to show you an edited version of the trailer. I've kind of tried to cut out. I'll try to cut out the bit that might get us with a copyright strike. But I've also tried to cut out a bit of the more gruesome stuff. But it's not too bad. But I will kind of give you a warning about that, if you like. So there's that to come. So the animals film then. So what we've got here is the DVD, that picture above me. That's the one I've just shown you. So that's the DVD, and the poster for the DVD is the one in the middle. Really, the one to the right is how it looked when it came out in VHS form, which is videotape. I suppose there might be some people nowadays who don't know what VHS means. It stands for Video Home System. So, yes. Well, I mean, we're going to go back to film as well, in the sense that when we showed it in Liverpool, it was 16mm film. So the story starts in 1977, when Victor Schonfeld was in New York, and he was part of something called the New York Political Film Group. And he said that he was interested in using what he calls cinematic language to challenge habitual thinking. And so he conceived the idea of the animals film. He said that he thought that through cinema, then he could make people feel a different way. I'm going to talk a little bit about his rationale, because they insisted on it being released in theaters before it was released eventually to TV. And so Schonfeld conceived the animals film as a consciousness-raising event, really. It's quite long. It's over 2 hours. So it's kind of a long event, if you like. The music is by Robert Wyatt. In fact, I still have my original soundtrack LP, which runs both sides, runs to 28 minutes. So it's quite short in that sense. And then also the title song, which is the bit that's cut out of the trailer, which is why a lot of it is going to be silent, was by Talking Heads, and it was called Mind. And you see there right at the bottom corner, I need something to change your mind, which is one of the refrains of the film, and of course the song as well. So the idea was to use cinema to challenge ways that people, think about things. And he wanted to release it in cinemas first. And in the DVD version, which has got a really good interview with Victor Schonfeld, he explains the rationale, and he says there's a big difference between watching a film, as it were, in the dark, pay for a ticket, you go in, and that's a different experience than watching something on TV, or nowadays watching something streamed when people will be kind of taking a break, making a cup of tea, this kind of stuff. And so he thought that the cinematic experience would be really powerful, because in a kind of weird sense, people are a little bit trapped there, because they're, you know, in a cinema with a lot of other people. So that's the kind of rationale. The film industry itself was rather shocked by the idea of putting out a full-length documentary at the time, although it's quite common now. I mean, you might think of you know, the documentaries by people like Michael Moore, for example. And so in that sense, it's not an unusual thing now, but it was then. In fact, one of the things about the Animals film is it's quite groundbreaking in that sense. Now, this is interesting because, as many of you might know, I used to be a projectionist, and this is the quad. So this size of poster was called a quad in the cinema business, and so this was the one that used to go outside theaters. And the person holding it is Kim Stallwood, who we met last time in the I'm getting commentary from behind, in the first time tunnel about the vivisection movement in Britain. And so he's holding his signed and also framed edition of the quad. It was an AA film, so in modern day that would probably mean a 15 rating. Schoenfeld found a radio personality to fund it. She had 2 flats in New York City, one of which was apparently used exclusively for the stray cats that she looked after. And so she offered to fund the film. And Schoenfeld said that she actually said, look, I don't want you to go around begging people for a lot of money, you know, lots of different people. So tell me how much it's going to be and I'll pay for all of it. And so that's what the agreement was. So they came up with an initial budget of $68,000. But Schoenfeld said that in actual fact, in the end, it was about 10 times that. So it was a bigger thing than they kind of knew that they were getting into, because everyone in this adventure was kind of breaking ground. You know, this film shows some scenes that have never been shown before, but also the filmmaking technique and the people involved. This was the first time that they did it. Now, my first involvement with this is back in Liverpool. I was part of something called the Merseyside Animal Rights Committee, and we showed the film in a public showing at this place, which is called the Blue Coat Chambers, which is in Liverpool. And so you go up that ramp in the middle there, you turn right, and there's kind of like a place where you can show films. So that was our first engagement with the film. We had a 16mm copy that was sent to us in order to do that. And when I was advertising this time tunnel, there's quite a lot of people commenting, oh yeah, we showed it in here, we showed it there, you know. And so that's how it came. So it was official cinema first, then these kind of independent cinemas, and then the TV. So a year later, we're up to 82, and this is when Channel 4, which was a brand new TV station in Britain, launched. And so they decided to show the Animals film in their first week. And in fact, it was on their third night of broadcasting, which is November the 4th. And the audience was estimated at over 1 million people, which was pretty good. And November the 4th, they didn't know it at the time, but they released it during World Vegan Month, which was quite neat. But World Vegan Month didn't exist back in those days. So Jonathan Porritt, who was a very well-known environmentalist, I think he's a lord now, and also David Winner, who is an author, they write that with over 1 million viewers, the screening is regarded as, quote, an important moment in the growth of public awareness of animal exploitation. And so, as I said, it was a pretty big deal back in the day, in the sense that people were seeing footage that they'd never ever seen before. This was kind of groundbreaking in that sense. It was also shown again on Channel 4 during what was it, 1991, and they had a series going back in their own history, and they called it Banned, and so the Animals film was re-shown again. So the original film is 136 minutes long, and as I said, it was released in cinemas with the AA certificate. There was no cuts at all in terms of the one that went out to the theatres, because the British Board of Film Classification, which used to be called the British Board of Film Censors, gave it the AA signage, which meant that nobody young would see it, as it were. When it came to the TV, though, it was different. The Independent Broadcasting Authority were worried about some scenes, and so they called Schoenfeld in, and there was a negotiation about some scenes should be cut. Now, the scenes they wanted to cut, you would have thought would be the graphic things showing animal use, right? It wasn't that. It was they wanted to cut some scenes involving animal activists. And so they were worried that the film was so powerful and so kind of persuasive that this was a real moral problem, that it could incite crime or even lead to civil disorder, or kind of promote the idea that this is so bad that direct action is therefore justified. So that was the rationale. The film was so devastating that illegal activities would, as it would, be justified, and it might even prompt them. So in the end, Schoenfeld did agree to cut about 7 minutes, which was mainly at the end. In the DVD version, you do get the original, and then you get a new director's cut, as well as some little extras. Geraldine Buck, a prize-winning author, said in 1982 that some scenes from the Animals film will stay with her forever. And she writes, quote, "The film ends with a desperate optimism. There is footage of the British Animal Liberation Front's raids on research establishments and sabotage of hunts." Slightly wrong, but it doesn't really matter. "After watching 2 hours of appalling atrocities, the only appropriate response to the ALF criminal activities is a rousing and prolonged cheer." So that's what the film censors were a little bit worried about, and the TV people were worried about, in the sense that that was, coming out in the reviews from the journalists, kind of like, go for it type thing. And so they decided then that they'd have to have some cuts. And so reluctantly, Schoenfeld agreed that 7 minutes will be cut. But in terms of the rest of it, it was shown on TV in full, all at once, with no ad breaks. So again, that was fairly unusual. It features quite a lot of cartoons and interviews and adverts to break the film up. And Schoenfeld talks about that as well in the DVD interview, in the sense that they didn't want it to be relentless. And the Animals film is seen as not as relentless as something like Earthlings or Dominion, in the sense that they deliberately broke it up using other bits, like, as I said, cartoons and stuff. In fact, you'll see a couple of examples of the cartoon in the trailer, which I'm going to show you now. So in terms of content warning for the trailer, I've cut the sound quite a lot. So a lot of this is silent. And I've also cut a couple of visual scenes, but there still are scenes involving chicks on a conveyor belt. There is a really weird, seems to be an advert or a promotional film for the turtle soup business, which really indicates, attitudes at the time. And you would think nowadays that the industry would have known not to talk in those terms. And then right at the end, there's a little bit of footage of monkeys being experimented on, but it's not particularly graphic. But the interesting thing is what the narrator is saying. So let's see if we can put this on. So this is how the film starts, but the kind of talking heads music is on at this stage. This is the bit I've cut out because I thought we might get into some copyright problems. As I said, again, you've got to think that some of these, that's an example of the cartoon, some of these scenes had never really been seen before, you know, certainly not in cinemas, and then later in TV.
Use this bat here for loading out boars. If you get two boars fighting, they can cut themselves up pretty good with it. I go through and I bust their noses. Usually after you bust their nose, gives them something else to think about.
And you got a terrible view about fur now.
I would take a dim view of making a purchase of a fur coat if I gave it any thought. I just eliminate it from my mind.
Yeah, I always remember that scene where, I just eliminated it from my mind. In fact, there is another scene involving some teenage kids, and one of them was saying, well, as long as I didn't see it, I will eat flesh, you know, but I wouldn't want to see it being produced, kind of thing. And of course, we still get that kind of issue nowadays, don't we? So it's kind of, as it were, known to us.
Don't underrate the strength of the vested interests of various kinds, agricultural, scientific, and particularly in the chemical and the pharmaceutical industries, and especially, of course, factory farming.
So that voice there was Lord Lord Houghton, who played a big role in trying to get animals into politics in the 1980s. And the actual scene, of course, was one of the McDonald's adverts, you know, the kind of hamburger patches and this kind of stuff, the idea that hamburgers grow like vegetables.
Upside down and completely helpless, they're lugged unceremoniously off to the cannery. At this point, it's just as well a turtle only sticks his neck out once. Seems he recognizes a friend. Well, he'll soon be in the soup himself.
So I don't think the industry would say that nowadays.
On a Saturday morning, they have nothing better to do but protest about animals, you know?
500 rads of gamma radiation, delivered at the rate of 50 rads per day, failed to degrade the performance of the test animals in either accuracy or reaction time, a definite advantage in civil defense, military, and spaceflight operations. And somehow, one gets the impression that the chimpanzee is proud of his contribution.
And that's the end of the audio. And again, really interesting kind of attitudes being shown in that, being proud of their contribution, as though they've got anything to do with it. And then just at the end, there's just an advert for the DVD. So I thought I'd leave that in. Again, might stop me getting some kind of ban or some kind of copyright thing. So audio DVD people. I suppose that's what I've got to say. Right, let's switch back to this. So, as I said then, the Animals film is seen as not as graphic and as relentless as Earthlings or Dominion. But interesting, a lot of people will know Benny Malone, and he said that he found it the other way around. He found this one, this film was a bit more disturbing than those. Probably kind of the reverse of the reason, I suppose. So it features cartoons, as I said, and those interviews and all the adverts to break it up and that kind of stuff. Things that I remember about it is there's one scene which I've never forgotten, which is a veal farmer talking about his industry, and he stood there with the veal unit behind him, and he said, "This is really good. It's going really well, and we're very pleased with it. You know, the business is going fine. The only thing we don't like is the confining." So Schoenfeld said, "What do you mean by confining?" And he said, "Well, we have to be here, you know, 7 days a week, twice a day to feed them and all this kind of stuff." So this veal farmer was complaining about confining, but he was complaining about his confinement rather than the other animals, which is, I suppose, pretty typical. And then the other bit that I remember is Schoenfeld is going around saying, do you eat animals? I think he just saying that as an opening kind of thing. And a woman said, well, yeah, I work in a meat packing plant. And Schoenfeld said, so what do you feel about that? And she suddenly gets quite defensive. And she goes, well, I've never really thought about it. And so Schoenfeld said, well, now that you're thinking about it, wouldn't let her off the hook, as it were. And then she's kind of looking around to see what she can do, and said, well, I wouldn't eat cats or dogs. And he says, why? And he, oh, well, they don't seem very tasty. And so it's really quite interesting, the fact that once she was questioned about what she was doing, it became, very kind of difficult for her, if you like. So as I said, a lot of groundbreaking stuff in there in terms of film. It was the first time that debeaking was filmed. And that particular shot of debeaking became quite famous and became used over and over again in the movement until we got more modern footage. I'm not going to show you any of it because it's pretty gruesome. And also, again, content warning about language. The Animals film was the first time I ever heard the phrase rape rack. And it was in relation to pig breeding at the time. And I did a podcast with Harold Brown, who was a farmer and now is a vegan activist. And I said, do you think the farmers still use the phrase rape rack? And he said they do, but they don't publicly anymore. So they might use that kind of phrase amongst themselves, but they know it's not a good PR thing, so they've dropped it publicly, if you like. In terms of the effect of the film, a lot of people go vegetarian and stroke vegan because of it, including people like human rights lawyer Michael Mansfield, also Elvis Costello, the singer, quite a few others, but those are the two that have been mentioned in the blurb, as it were. Okay, now we're moving forward now to the reaction, which is quite a few years later. This is 2009. And so the director of the Animals film was asked to go on the BBC World Service, the radio, to do 2 shows about the Animals film, looking back, as it were, 28 years later. And so these were 2 World Service specials, and you can get them by just Googling it. I think BBC One Planet, you'll find them. And his other remit was to report on what he thought was the progress of the animal movement in those 28 years. And it's really evident, really, that Schoenfeld was pretty shocked by the lack of progress. So he was fairly kind of upset about the fact that the movement had done so badly. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I'm trying to remove that, actually. Remove. Okay. Okay, let's put this back up. All right. Just bear with me a second. I've just got to load something else before we continue. There we go. Right. Okay. Okay. So the One Planet specials. Schoenfeld interviews quite a lot of people, amongst them being food expert Professor Tim Lang. He was a big voice in Britain at one point. Ecofeminist Vandana Shiva, author Joan Denea, human rights lawyer Michael Mansfield, as I mentioned before. Also, the then head of the HSUS, Wayne Purcell, law professor Gary Francione, and I was interviewed. I had to go down to a local Dublin radio station to do some taping, but my bit was cut, unfortunately, but never mind. It's very clear, though, in terms of these 2 programs. The first one is about farming. The second one is about vivisection. The first one is by far the more interesting from the movement point of view now, in the sense that he was really assessing the progress. And both Mansfield and Schoenfeld are clearly very disappointed about the movement's progress in 28 years. He expected those to be, much better, much further ahead, if you like. For example, Schoenfeld said that the likes of the HSUS and PETA and the RSPCA all work with animal user industries to produce tiny reforms that leave the exploitation of other animals, as he puts it, intact. And when they do get these tiny victories, they then claim a victory. And he's very disappointed about this. So I'm going to play you this little clip from that, and you can see what I mean about that.
Getting a little bit soft or co-opted in your high-profile role?
I think all you need to do is look at the agriculture industry in the United States. They fear HSUS more than any other organization.
The Humane Society, like the RSPCA and PETA, has heaped praise on businesses that profit from meat eating for making small adjustments in their purchasing policies.
We've worked with corporations from Burger King to Denny's to Whole
Burger
Foods.
King, the fast food chain, just saying no to animal cruelty. Margaret Brennan is on the money behind the decision.
Burger King making a bold move today. The King moving to suppliers who do not confine their animals in crates or cages.
This is going to get Burger King a lot of publicity, a lot of attention.
We've worked to establish new standards for procurement policies.
BK will start slowly. 2% of eggs will be cage-free.
We are determined to charge ahead on all of these fronts.
And the new regulations the Humane Society claims as signal victories leave intact the intensive systems of exploitation. Cows, pigs, and chickens consigned to short lives, packed into windowless buildings, then slaughter. I put this point to Wayne Pacelli.
I generally disagree with that line of thought. I don't think that it's a minor matter to remove 20 million laying hens in California from battery cages.
But they are still confined indoors, aren't they?
Well, they may be, or they may not be, but we've had decades of activism and no success until HSUS entered the fray.
Right. So as you can see, there was a disagreement there between the parties on terms of how good we were doing. This was a time when it was the end of the ban the battery cage campaign, and I think that the industry kind of sidestepped the movement in a sense because they came up with the idea of the enriched battery cage, and I don't think anybody really foresaw that. And so then they had to launch campaigns against the enriched cages, and then it came up with the idea of cage-free, and cage-free then was translated to one big cage. And so this is always the kind of problem with that. I mean, Francione, obviously, you'd expect in terms of his contribution to the radio thing, that he was saying that, look, if all that effort in the last 28 years has been put into vegan education, we would have been a long way ahead of just kind of getting rid of the barren battery cages. And the idea of that some suppliers would have switched 2% of their eggs to cage-free. I mean, these are very kind of almost pitiful advances, really, but that's where we are in a sense. So both programs, but particularly the first one, as I said about farming, is a powerful critique of the animal movement. I can't help wondering what Schoenfeld would think of the movement right now, and I still don't think he'd be too impressed. In fact, we are working for him to be a guest on the Animal Rights Show. So if that comes forward, that would be a really kind of brilliant thing. And then finally, we have, again, this is 2009. I took part in an Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach commentary. Again, this is still online. You can find this if you go to the site and then look for commentaries. It might be under podcast, I'm not quite sure. So Gary Francione was there. Elizabeth Collins from New Zealand was there, and I was there, and we kind of assessed the first part really of the the Schoenfeld radio thing. I remember Elizabeth being very critical of Schoenfeld himself on the grounds that even then, 28 years later, he was still a vegetarian. He'd been a vegetarian since he made the Animals film, but hadn't moved to veganism. So again, whether that has changed now, it would be an interesting thing, because it would be a bit shocking, really, if it hadn't. But then again, in the first one, the one about farming, he puts himself through a kind of test, because he said that he found himself as a vegetarian kind of craving flesh now and again. And so they did a kind of psychological test with him and somebody else to find out what all that. That's really kind of fascinating as well. It is really worth listening to those two things. And I think they're both only about 28 minutes long, so it's not too bad in that sense. Right, so that's the animals films. And as I said, I suppose I would still regard it as my generation's Earthlings, and very powerful, still is. The DVD is available with its kind of director's cut and the original and all that kind of stuff. And just have a quick look in the chat now. As I've said, this is only the second time we're doing this new series, and I wanted to make it interactive, but it is a bit difficult to kind of switch to the chat. So I don't know whether I'm just going to have to revisit the chat at the end of each one. Something I've got to kind of work on a little bit. So yeah, yeah, Spiritual Vegan wouldn't want to watch that. No. All right. Hello, Laura. How are you doing? I was lucky enough to catch a special screening of this film in New York City about 10 years ago. It's my favorite animal rights film to this day. It's really interesting, though, because of the time it was made. There's the narrator, which is Julie Christie, the actor, obviously reading a script, but other animals are called it in the film, which probably wouldn't happen now, which is interesting. So again, I suppose mark that down on the progress side of the movement, although there seems to be a bit of pushback at the moment with that. Other people now defending the idea of calling other animals it again, which is disappointing, to say the least. Possibly the most significant moment of the early 80s. Yeah, it was. It does kind of tie in really with what we were talking about last time, which was the growth of the anti-vivisection movement in Britain. Because this was a time, the early 80s, when there was a big surge in activity, and it was a kind of a peak. And some people would claim it was the largest peak we've ever had in the movement. But then, of course, all social movements, they kind of experience peaks and troughs. And I suppose the last 5 years we're on the rise again. We need to revive that group and the concept of the power of the cinema. Yeah, it is interesting. I don't think I did it much justice really, but it is interesting, Schoenfeld's rationale for having it shown in cinemas. Because Philip Windiat, who is used to write for The Beast, and he was involved in the early days, he was part of the production of the Animals film, but he is the person who kind of interviews Schoenfeld in the DVD. But I think it was his first question: why did you want to watch one of these films? Why did you want to make one of these films? And also, what was the score about having it in the cinema as well? Colleen, that picture's I don't know which picture it is, but you're probably right. Okay. All art forms have the power to change the way people think about things, so we desperately need to reclaim that concept of art. Well, I guess people would say, well, films have carried on coming out all the time, and of course now it's just a question. See, I suppose in one weird way with the internet now, if the Animals film was released now, it would just be another film that would kind of people would talk about for a few days or a few weeks, and then there'd be Land of Hope and Glory 2 or something. And so it wouldn't have the same impact, in the sense that that was the go-to film for ages, I mean years, in terms of the movement, and a lot of it prompted because of the things that it revealed. It prompted a lot of lines of inquiries by other films, which was really good as well. Yes, that's the pig handler. That's right. Yeah. The use of violence, of course. Obviously this is the thing when we talk about animal rights violations, and we talk about systematic animal use, and you do start to. I mean, you can just go to someone like Gail Aisnett's book Slaughterhouse, to see the routinized kind of way that other animals are exploited and killed and have their rights violated. But also, it becomes so routinized that if, for example, another animal falls off the kill line, the animal is blamed for slowing the process down and punished for not going to their death as quick as they should have done. Yeah, you know, so that's how kind of corrupted these kind of industries can be, you know. Yeah, Laura, you agree with Benny? Yeah. Well, I was quite surprised when Benny told me that. I was quite surprised, but I can see the point for sure. And I suppose the cartoons and the vox pops and everything, because they break things up, I suppose maybe you're more receptive to the film and you're not kind of hiding away from it almost and kind of guarding yourself. So maybe you might remember more because of that. That would be an interesting social psychology thing as well. One of the things that affected me most in Dominion also wasn't graphic. It was a shot of cars calmly driving past the slaughterhouse, not even noticing or caring. Yeah, well, there's a lot to be said for that, because you do notice. I mean, if we're driving along, if you're driving along a motorway with a vegan, then we'll notice the slaughterhouse trucks, and we'll notice the so-called livestock transporters, and we'll notice the butchers' vans and everything. Nobody else seems to. Even if they've got, as it were, chickens looking out of the slots, and hay flying off the back of the van, it still, people seem to be oblivious of it. And I got that impression when in my early days, in the early 80s, when we used to go sabbing, I started to notice things like the farms and the vivisection laboratories. And again, you'd think, oh, only we would do that, that everybody else is oblivious to it. And yet we're not responsible for these places because we're not their customers. And so the people who, as it were, oppose them know about them, and the people who buy from them, it's all oblivious to them. It's really weird. So, yeah, really powerful film. It is indeed. Now, have we got any more? Yeah, well, you've got that thing, and again, you could make that argument that Colleen, this is not meant for you. You're a vegan already. There's no need for you to watch this film, and in fact, you're probably not going to learn anything new in it. So, in that sense, there's no point. I mean, on Still Alive, Ronnie and I have talked about this thing about some vegans will almost like torture themselves with watching films, and sometimes I think that's also some of the rationale for people to go to the Save protests as regularly as they do, because they don't need any more footage. It's just that they buy into that concept that I have a bit of a difficulty with, the kind of bearing witness thing. But it's based on that thing. Well, if they're going through it, the least I can do is watch. But it's dangerous if you do it too much. That's saying. Yeah, Bernie says we're evolving our language. That is true. It still needs to be, as it were, policed, which is uncomfortable. But it is part of the kind of reflexivity of social movement that we talk about the language we use on the grounds that we're claims makers. So our language is incredibly important. Some people say, oh, well, it doesn't matter, what you say, kind of thing. But it does. So seems to be right. Anything else? Very powerful film. But yeah. I thought somebody said habits. It was Colleen saying habits. Okay. Yeah, language is important. Yeah, that's our takeaway. Idea for today then. Okay, so as you can see then, this is only the second one of this new series, and we're still evolving it, and I need to do better with the with the chat somehow, but I'm not quite sure how to do it in the sense of kind of going through it fairly concisely without stopping too much, but we'll see. Anyway, people, thanks so much for joining us, and we are at the beginning of starting our archive, so that's quite exciting in itself. And with that, I shall say goodbye and see you next week. Hey, Yoslings. Hello, 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 and welcome to yet another vegan time tunnel. So we're creating an archive, which is all going to be in one place eventually, which they're now, really, but we're building on it. Thanks so much for everybody who tuned into the special last week, which was about the 1989 animal rights debate, which has been rediscovered in full. That was a good session, and if you haven't seen that one, it'd be worth looking at the recording, because it's a really quite interesting kind of document, in the sense that it was quite a formal debate. It wasn't exactly kind of Oxford or Cambridge, but it was a formal debate, which you don't tend to see nowadays. So it is quite interesting. Right, in terms of today, then. I've entitled this, "When Did the Vegan Movement Stop Being Terrified of the Word Vegan?" which sounds a little bit odd, but we're going to kind of explore this idea of the move towards the acceptance of the word within the vegan movement, which again sounds a bit strange, but we'll see how that pans out in the coming minutes. The timeline, we're going to enter our tunnel in 1990 and come out, in actual fact, in the present day. So it's a long time tunnel in that sense. Now, generally speaking, we live in a time when many people, many activists would say that the moral baseline of the animal liberation movement is veganism. We might simply say that. Veganism is our movement's moral baseline. We might say that it's central to everything that we do as a movement, and we might say it's pretty much central to everything that we say as a movement. Didn't used to be like that, of course, but this is what the time tunnel is about, in a sense. So in terms of the word vegan, we're used to seeing it virtually everywhere now. It's on the web, it's on websites, we see it on street billboards, we see it on restaurants and cafe menus, and we see it in supermarkets. So the word vegan seems to be everywhere now. And as I said, it wasn't always like this. In fact, there are some modern day animal activists who claim that veganism should not be the moral baseline of our movement, but activism should be. So some have argued that we should decenter the word vegan within the vegan movement, or actually refrain from using it at all. A prominent activist group a few years ago called for a boycott of the word. So this time tunnel is slightly different from that, in the sense that it's about a related issue which is slightly different, which is, when did the movement stop being frightened of the word? But it's also got another couple of kind of sub-questions, which are, is it fully not frightened of the word now, which is quite interesting? And also, is it true that there seems to be some resistance or some wariness of presenting in the vegan movement a consistent vegan message? So that's our kind of menu, if you like, for today. And so that, in fact, is our time tunnel. Yeah, so I remember to do the title. So I just want to make a clarification at the start here, which is that this time tunnel is not designed to be an attack on any individual or any group. The idea is for it to be descriptive of the changes that have occurred over the years in terms of, you know, what we now recognize as the vegan movement and what we now recognize as the claims that the vegan movement makes, essentially. Because it's not that long ago when the animal movement would say virtually anything other than the word vegan. And so the question is why? And that's because until very recently, a lot of professionals and writers and strategists in the movement, they all claimed that veganism was a scare word, which was sometimes best avoided and certainly for most downplayed. And so that was the situation until relatively recently in the movement. One strategist, for example, argued that, well, in perhaps another 20 years or so, it might be safe to use the word vegan, but not now. For now, he said, we should recognize that we're in a pre-vegan world and act accordingly. Now, of course, from my point of view, and looking at the history of the vegan social movement, this flies in the face of Donald Watson's idea, which he presented in his very first bulletin for the movement in November 1944, that we need to ripen people up to new ideas. We you know, they're not going to just kind of fall over them. You know, we've got to present new ideas. So the more we avoid using the word that we want to, that's a bad thing from Watson's point of view. For some strategies, it's a good thing, but we'll see. Even the groups of the 1990s who used the word vegan in their organizations' names, they came to regret it. So an example of that is Vegan Outreach. Vegan Outreach came into being in 1990, and it was called Animal Liberation Action at the time. And they came to specialize in giving pamphlets out to college and university students in the main. Around 1994, they had a pamphlet entitled Vegetarianism. And then not long after that, they had another one called Justice for All, which I found an intriguing title, because I don't know whether that was, as it were, an intersectional message. I've never seen that pamphlet. So if anybody got one, I'd love to see that. So the Justice for All pamphlet, this did talk about veganism for the first time, but it presented veganism as a diet. What we'll see in the coming while is the fact that this is a repeated thing, that when the groups and the movement started to accept the word and started to use the word, it was almost exclusively presented as a diet at first. And there's still a lot of that going on. So that's a problem in my eyes. In 1995, this group changed its name then to Vegan Outreach. However, one of the co-founders of Vegan Outreach came to regret using the word vegan in their name, and fairly kind of early on, if you like. So this is an AR Zone, Animal Rights Zone interview with Matt Ball, and this is 2011. So Ball was asked if he would call Vegan Outreach the same if he began it all again. And he basically answered that he wouldn't do. He said that within a decade of 1995, they regretted using the word. The word vegan hurts us, he said. And it was about money. He said that animal-friendly foundations and rich non-vegans didn't like the word vegan, and so therefore they wouldn't fund something called vegan, and so therefore their income was adversely affected by actually standing up and calling themselves their own philosophy, essentially. Vegetarian and welfare corporations had a much better chance of being funded. Now, since then, Matt Ball has abandoned veganism as a campaigning idea altogether, and he started something which is still online called One Step for Animals, and that was started in about 2016. I don't know if you've ever seen any of that, but their first video, which they've now since taken down, was essentially Matt Ball attacking veganism, calling vegans equivalent to Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, saying that vegans were rude. And so he's come up with this idea of one step for animals, which are basically asking people to do one thing, which is not to eat chickens. So it goes from vegan outreach to don't eat chickens, is his personal journey. So you could say then that that's less than a promising start in the United States, at least. So what about Britain? Now, this is Robin Lane. Robin Lane was the ALF press officer after Ronnie Lee. And this is his 2010 Animal Rights Zone interview. So Robin was part of the Vegan Society ruling council for a while. And in 1996, there was a proposal put to the council of the Vegan Society that an annual vegan event should be initiated. So the Vegan Society membership were in favor, but the Vegan Society itself were hesitant on the basis of the cost of it and the energy that would be expended doing it and the staff who would be, as it were, employed organizing it. So this means then that the very first proposal for the very first national vegan event in Britain was turned down by the Vegan Society. Now, Robin was running a grassroots group at the time called CARF, which stands for Campaign Against Leather and Fur. And so they decided to develop the idea instead of the Vegan Society. And so by 1998, they'd got themselves all set up, and the first national vegan festival occurs, run by CARF, but with some support from the Vegan Society. By 2004, which is only 19 years ago, this event becomes the London Vegan Festival, because other festivals now were springing up in the regions of Britain. So that was what was going on. Now, these other events, we probably know, are often under the name of Veg Fest rather than Vegan Festival. So that was then, and it still is kind of now to that extent. So turning to the publications put out by the grassroots of the movement, this is Arc News, and this is from 1996. Now, Arc News was put together and distributed by an old friend of mine called Neil Lee, and Neil will be the subject of a time tunnel to come. So it was just like a very small kind of A5 booklet. It was kind of zine style, if you like, just photocopied, very kind of rough and ready. The production values weren't great, but it was really just a bulletin to kind of G people up and get them going. And part of it was always this animal rights calendar, which was produced by a group called Veggies, which were and still are, I think, in Nottingham. So it's not easy to read, but I'm going to just pick out the bits that are there, in the sense that they're advertising a massed vegetarian rally for the activists. And then on another page, they're talking about a national vegetarian week. So in the grassroots, they were still following the lead of a lot of the national groups and focusing on vegetarianism rather than veganism. The good thing about the grassroots, though, is that they were the ones who were the quickest and most likely to talk about veganism. So that was a good thing. And here's an example of that. So this is Archangel. Archangel was a very well-produced kind of booklet, very supportive of direct action. This, again, is 1999, and they're advertising the second National Vegan Festival in that. If we turn to the more professional national groups in Britain, this is Viva. Now, Viva's name is interesting. in the sense that VIVA stands for Vegetarian International Voice for Animals. And if you look to the left of the slide there, that is 1998. To the right, it's year 2000. In fact, if you look at that blue kind of heading, that's part of their document, which has a really long interview with Paul McCartney. Linda McCartney had died by then, but they called Paul and Linda McCartney the voice of vegetarianism. And it's interesting because McCartney says in the interview that his son James is the only one of the family who is vegan. And he says, I know that I should be, but I just can never kind of get there. And in more subsequent interviews, he said that Stella went vegan. But, and the same thing, Stella said to Paul, you should go vegan, but he's never been able to make it, really. Right. So to the right, the top square is about pig slaughter and animal welfare. The insert at the bottom is the last message from that piece. And this is where Viva are offering veggie packs for the audience. Bottom right marks the time in 2000 when vegan recipes were getting more attention. So I'm about to lose my voice, I think. Sadly, as I kind of suggested, veganism as a philosophy is never discussed. This was a long period when vegan offered vegetarian starter kits as well as vegan ones. Help, what's going on with my voice here? I'm losing it, bad style. Hang on a second. I'm doing a Ronnie Lee. Ronnie lost his voice on a Still Alive about a month ago. And he soldiered through, so I'm going to try. I think I'll just try and speak a little bit lower, see if that helps. Okay, so this is where we see the name again, Vegetarian International Voice for Animals. Now again, this now is 2012. This is only 11 years ago. So they've still got the name and they're still promoting vegetarianism. And then if you look at Company's House, as it were, this is their journey towards, or their evolution towards veganism. It seems that their first name was Viva, then Vegetarian International Voice for Animals, then it progressed to the Vegetarian and Vegan Foundation, and then it's now called the Vegan Viva, the Vegan Foundation, as far as I'm aware. Now, again, this is not to kind of pick them out and go, you know, bad people here. This is to show the evolution of these ideas that, first of all, in the movement, but not that long ago, it was always about vegetarianism. And then they started to become a mix and a match between the two ideas. And now, in the last few years, there's been this acceptance of the word vegan and much more of a focus on it. Again, with the caveat that most of it is still based on presenting it as a diet, which is a real shame. This is Animal Aid. Animal Aid has been described as Britain's first animal rights group when it was formed in 1977 by somebody called Jean Pink. I think Jean Pink is almost like a forgotten name in the movement now. So 24 years ago, Animal Aid were all about their veggie months, or the veggie month that was going on, and they were featuring a bunch of British vegetarian celebrities. When it came to their feature on world hunger or food security issues, which are a long-term vegan campaigns and concerns, they offered a vegetarian solution. This is 2006, which is 17 years ago. So Veggie Month is still heavily promoted. But this again is where we start to see now the mix and match. So you're getting vegetarian stuff and vegan stuff in the same publication being featured. This is actually someone called Claudia Tarry urging Animal Aid members to try a vegan diet. And she says this, if you took to the streets and asked people to list words they associate with vegans, the responses are likely to be derogatory, difficult, boring. See if you recognize yourself in this, people. Pasty-faced, preachy, weird, the nut roast and lentils brigade. So that dates it in the sense that this was before the big rise in the vegan meats and everything. If you told them that vegans are often enthusiastic about food, have healthy appetites, and a passion for gooey desserts, creamy sauces, and the occasional not so healthy fry up, they probably wouldn't believe you. And then the next line of the bit that I won't read, but it starts, there are 3 reasons for adopting a vegan diet. So again, this is very typical of the period. So when the national groups became brave enough to mention the word vegan, or talk about veganism, the philosophy is not presented as such. It's always presented as a diet, which is a real kind of shame. Because the current definition, the one that we now regard as the official definition of veganism, was developed between 18 and 27 years before 2006. So it was decades before this publication. And of course, the first 4 words of the official definition marks veganism out as a philosophy. Veganism is a philosophy. That's the first 4 words. And yet, that's not what gets covered. It's the dietary aspects of it, which is, as I said, a real kind of shame about it. Dropping back to the 1999 booklet for a moment, Animal Aid were much more willing to feature veganism on their youth pages. So they would use the word much more openly on their youth pages. I don't know, presumably seeing some kind of difference between the adult members and their youth members. But yet again, the caveat again is initially, at least, always presented as a diet. In fact, in this, you can't really read it. It's very small, but here they do talk about calf separation. Is one thing that is mentioned, but they also give a warning that, quote, being vegan can be more difficult than going veggie. And so again, there was quite a lot of that kind of rhetoric in the movement as well. Now, this is interesting. This is from 2012. In fact, I messaged the person who presented this in Dublin in 2012, just to check the date. So this is an Animal Aid school talks package. So essentially, it's guidelines for people who are hoping to do talks on behalf of Animal Aid. And the title is Guidelines for Talks on Vegetarianism, 2012. The guide advises Animal Aid school speakers to tell students the definition of vegetarian and of a vegetarian and vegan diet. And so it just goes, tell the students the definitions of a vegetarian and vegan diet. Vegetarians don't eat the flesh of animals, and then there's talk about lacto-vegetarians and so forth, ovo-lacto-vegetarians and everything else, which was more popular in the United States than it was in Britain, funnily enough. But then you've got 1.5 lines about veganism. Vegans avoid eating all animal products such as meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, milk, cheese, and yogurt, and honey. Now, apart from that 1 and a bit line on veganism, the rest of this entire document is entirely focused on vegetarianism. And so this is the kind of like little kind of outline of what you get in the document, which I've got right here. So you've got this definition thing, and then you've got all the stuff about vegetarian diets. And so again, even well into the 21st century, we've still got this reluctance to really talk very much about veganism. So what have we got here? Creating all those terms for types of vegetarians. Yes. Well, as I said, it was very popular in the States, you know, to actually describe yourself as, oh, well, I'm an ovo vegetarian, I'm a lacto, and then you got lacto ovo vegetarians, and that's when some people started using the word pescatarian as well. So it became a bit of a thing to start breaking vegetarian into its own little camps in a way. So this is academia then. We're going to turn to how things have been in academia, and we would hope, wouldn't we, that things would be better within the academic world. So this is Gary Francione and Anna Charlton. They ran the Rutgers University Animal Rights Law Center. I think sometimes they call it a clinic. So this is a 1996 document on animal rights and the left. And the one to the right, the New Left Review there that you can see, that's Benton and Redfern on the same topic. And it was quite interesting, really, because in the 1990s, talking about the animal rights movement as a leftist movement wasn't controversial whatsoever. And so Francione is reporting on his own attending a lecture and then going for dinner with the leftist speaker, as it were. Francione chooses the vegetarian option and the lecturer eats flesh. And so this lecturer then notices that Francione's plate is flesh free and asks him, you know, are you still a vegetarian? And Francione writes this: being asked about being a vegetarian legitimizes at least a polite inquiry about being a non-vegetarian. So I answered his question, yes, I am still very much a vegetarian. Now, this is the point of this in terms of then and now, because Gary Francione went vegan in 1982 when he'd read a book called Fetid Kingdoms by John Bryant, which I've mentioned before, I'm sure. So yeah, this is 1996. So this is 14 years after going vegan, where he's still self-identifying as a vegetarian. Now, think about that in terms of the modern movement now. It's just not something that we would do, you know, which is really quite interesting. Turning to academic books, the left is Francione's excellent book, actually, Rain Without Thunder. And that is the same year as the Law Center commentary that we've just seen. Now, in Rain, there is no mention of veganism at all. To the right is the intro to animal rights. Now, that's 2000. This is 23 years ago. Again, there's no mention of veganism in this book. Which brings me to Dada Funfair, or Fanfare. My friend Melanie Joy, now this is 2010, 13 years ago. Now, this is the book that introduced the movement to the vegetarian concept of carnism. And now this is part of the index, and there's no mention of veganism, but there are several mentions of vegetarianism. And then on one particular page, this is 131, if anyone wants to check. This is Melanie Joy talking about vegans. She describes vegans as pure vegetarians. She says she observes that vegans tend to be less disgusted by eggs and dairy products than they are by meat, as she calls flesh. And then she comes up with what she thinks is the reason for this. Canadian Vegan Forever, how is it possible? No mention of veganism in an animal rights book. Yes, well, quite. I mean, you know, well put. I mean, it's a pertinent question. And also, we're talking about this century now. We're talking about this century. You know, we do get some claims in the movement that we've been doing vegan education, and veganism has been the thing for decades and decades and decades, and it's been a failure. And part of this presentation is to show that that is not true. You know, in some senses, in terms of veganism being so central as it is now, it's only just beginning. So that's one message that I'm hoping to get over. So she's coming up with the reason for why she thinks that vegans are less disgusted by eggs and dairy. And she said it's because it's possible to obtain eggs and dairy without violence. she says. And therefore, because of that, it's less offensive, and because of that, it's less disgusting. Now, vegans consume a plant diet, not because they're personally offended or disgusted by anything. They do it because they want to oppose and boycott animal exploitation and animal rights violations. It's nothing to do with disgust and offense. So, obviously, I mean, I've said this before plenty of times now, in the sense that it is a favorite concept within the vegan movement, carnism. Whereas I tend to think that it's a dangerous thing to promote. And so the question then is, well, why is it dangerous to promote that? And I think that is because if any curious person was to Google or search on another search engine the word carnism, they will be directed to Dr. Melanie Joy, because she coined the word, and then to her organization like Pro-Veg. Not your bun, milk, absolutely. Only just beginning. Yes, it's almost like a shock, really, isn't it? The fact that, I mean, I've been vegan 44 years, and yet veganism wasn't part of that very much. And you know, Ronnie and I look back and think, how could that be? But it was. That this is the history of the movement that we lived through. So you've got Dr. Joy and her Pro-Veg organization, in which there are her close colleagues, her husband, Sebastian Joy, and also Tobias Leonhardt, sometimes known as the vegan strategist. So what nonsense will our vegan curious inquirer get if they ended up with Leonhardt through, you know, trying to find out what carnism is about? So I got a few examples of it. This is the first. On the vegan movement, it's a relatively young movement. It's about food. Now, to me, the kind of food-only vegans are as bad as the animals-only vegans, in the sense that they seem determined to slim down the meaning of veganism to every possible extent. And so whether you're going to classify it as a diet, or if you say it's only about other animals, then that is not giving the expansive version of what veganism actually was, the people who started the movement. Defining veganism as the total avoidance of animal products, always and everywhere, sets the bar unnecessarily high for non-vegans. So the strategy really boils down to, if the movement wasn't really vegan, it would help veganism as an idea, because that means then that vegans would be more plentiful and the vegan movement would be bigger. Essentially what it meant was that Tobias Leonhardt wanted the vegan movement to revert back to being the vegetarian movement. That's essentially what he was getting at. If we would say that veganism meant that 2 times a year, I'm just inventing something, you could eat non-vegan stuff and you still call yourself a vegan, is it possible that a lot of people, it would be a lot more attractive? Okay, so that was another part of it. There's people who say, like, we should always and every moment be open from the beginning about what we are doing. It should be clear that vegan is the end goal. I don't know why they say that. I don't understand that. And then the one that usually gets vegans a little bit agitated is this one. Someone who eats fish or sometimes a cookie with an egg is still a vegan in my eyes. So that to me is rather the danger of vegans employing the vegetarian concept of carnism. Okay, we turn to the States in a way, although we're going to come back to the British version of PETA. So this is People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, of course. They featured Paul McCartney for years and years and years. So the first one is Paul and Linda. So we're going back into the 1990s. And then the more recent one is much more recent, of course. And again, whenever they feature McCartney, then they have to talk about vegetarianism rather than veganism, because he himself is not a vegan. Some of their controversial, I've got a whole bunch of these, and I actually slimmed them all down. So I've only got a few examples now, because I thought there's no point in showing everything. These are the kind of ableist adverts. First of all, you've got the kind of fat shaming on the left there, the man and the big belly type of thing. And then the one that caused a lot of trouble was Save the Whales, Lose the Blubber, Go Vegetarian, which was out a few years ago, and that was a big banner. Morrissey there wants people to go vegetarian. I believe in recent years there's reports that Morrissey has finally gone vegan, but I'm not sure. Rise Against is a straight edge band, which always intrigues me. There's apparently 3 of their members are straight edge, and straight edge is usually associated with veganism, but there is a kind of vegetarian kind of version of straight edge, and so they seem to be in that one. So when you see Peter featuring Rise Against, it tends to be a vegetarian thing rather than a vegan one. Again, now this one is interesting. This one indicates some residual doubts, I think, in the national groups about the use of veganism. Chicks love a vegetarian. So this is an actor, I believe, for Peter. Now, this is 2019. This is 2019 when this was out. So that, again, is quite shocking in terms of the timeline, I think. These are, if you can see it, it might be more difficult to see it, I'm not quite sure. These are pages currently from the PETA site in Britain. And so they're talking about vegetarians and vegans, mix and match. And then there's a whole bunch of pages where they go through different age groups, but it's always the same, following the same idea of vegetarian and vegan. This is Mercy for Animals, and this is currently again. So they're talking about pro-vegetarian videos in that. And so again, I think that what this is indicating really is that even now, right now, there's still some wariness in some of the national groups about veganism. And so again, this idea of presenting a strong, consistent vegan message is kind of lost, on people. So that's a bit of a shame. This is Animal Equality. This is now. They have almost all their focus is on factory farming and also on flesh reduction campaigns. And you see at the bottom, visit Love Veg, which is their kind of recipe website. Now, most of the national groups, to give them credit, have got, CR vegan starter kit or CR vegan recipes. Animal Equality decided to keep with the word veg. Again, there's no real explanation here of the strong philosophical side of veganism. There's much more about talking about the diet aspects of it, which is, pretty upsetting, really. Now, these are possibly some indications of where this wariness is coming from, in the sense that this is the last few years, and these are grants that Animal Equality have got. And so in the last few years, say about 6 years, they've spent almost $11 million on animal welfare campaigns. These are kind of cage-free promotion, welfare-related campaigning. Now, it's interesting here because they get their grants from something called the Open Philanthropy Project. Now, what they might say, as an echo to what Matt Ball said, is that, yeah, but this project wouldn't give us money for vegan things. So if we want a lot of money off somebody, then we've got to extract the vegan. That's what they might say. A bigger set of grants is this one. This is Mercy for Animals. So they've spent 25 million plus on their corporate welfare campaigns, as they call it. The last grant was $12 million. And so again, I don't actually know. It's really interesting because when I talk to vegans about this, they tend not to know any of this. So I don't know whether this is something to do with the algorithms, the internet algorithms, but vegans tend to be shielders from this information, if you like. And so they don't know. But essentially, there's this thing about we're not committed to go fully vegan. And this is right now for some of the national groups. So for some critics of the movement, like the Gary Francione counter movement, for example, that shows that we don't really have a vegan movement in his view, because veganism is almost presented as one option you can take rather than the ethical option that is required. So that would be the big kind of problem from Francione's point of view. So if you ever see a Gary Francione video or meme and he's saying there isn't an animal rights movement or there isn't a vegan movement, that's what he means. That our movement doesn't present a consistent, strong vegan message all the time. And going back to Leonard, he doesn't even understand why you would. So there you go. Right, some good news. So we're coming up to the actual vegan campaigns now. These are pretty much 100% vegan-based campaigns. And again, it's interesting now to just note the dates that we're talking about. Earthlings Experience came into being in 2015. So that was well before AV, which was, oh, sorry, I got that wrong. 2005, came into being in 2005. AV came into being in 2016. Now, one thing that people don't know about the Earthling Experience is kind of how big it was and how widespread it had become. It had a very kind of DIY element to it, but these are all the kind of chapters or groups, for example. I always have a smile because they've included the Dublin group, which I was a member of, in the UK column, which won't go down well with the membership. So I tend not to tell them. So, you know, if you're watching people in Dublin, don't watch this bit. So yeah, so it's always been a very kind of DIY culture, really, Earthling Experience, and it's summed up with the slogan, which was on that first page. All you need is a laptop, a mask, and a public space. So it was very kind of not lackadaisical, but it was kind of loose. And it meant that people would bring their own laptops. You just get together, do your own thing. And my experience of the Earthling Experience was really good. You get as much in engagement as the so-called professional groups as well. This one goes to modern day, that as we will know the movement now. So AV, as I said, 2016. I couldn't find out We the Free. Now, We the Free is pretty recent. Somebody in the comments is almost bound to know when We the Free started, but it was only a few years ago, maybe, I don't know, 3-4, is it? And then the other one is the Animal Save movement, which is interesting because that's 2010. So that's actually a lot older than I would have imagined. But then it was called Toronto Animal Save, I believe. And so I'm not quite sure when it moved to, you know, the kind of international kind of global thing. I'm not quite sure. And then finally on this is 2015, and this is Go Vegan Island. So what we now understand as Go Vegan World, which are these images, started life in 2015 as Go Vegan Island, and then they became Go Vegan World in 2016. And a lot of people will have seen their huge billboards around about the place. They tend to do the big kind of motorway type billboards, the ones in the city centres, but they also do things like adverts on buses and that kind of stuff and all that, and smaller adverts inside the buses or inside trams, that kind of thing. So it seems then that there's much more evidence, if you like, that we've move now to a time where many more of even the bigger, well-known international organizations are taking a pretty firm vegan line. It's just interesting that we've still got some residual kind of wariness in the movement. You know, I suppose it's good that the newer influencers tend to be strict on veganism, although there are some that are trying to slim vegan down to be some kind of militant version of the RSPCA, but there are some others. Getting commentary now from the cat. So yeah, so that's your time tunnel, really. So have I missed any questions? Is the question, or I got time for a couple if you want to sling them up now. But as a relatively long-term vegan myself, I find it difficult to get over to relatively new vegans this story of the newness of it. You know, they come into a movement and they just see what is, but it's not been there very long. It's only just started. So again, with that kind of caveat, if anyone tells you that we've been doing vegan education for many decades and it's not been a success, they're frankly not telling you the truth, because we're literally only just starting. In historical terms, this is a new thing within our own movement. Even though we call it the vegan movement, it's is mainly focused on vegetarianism, and then you've got that mix and match, but then you've got the big focus on dietary aspects. So in terms of an unequivocal, strong vegan message, which is consistent and all the time, we really are at the beginning of that. And so it can't be true that we've been doing this for decades and decades and it's not worked. It just physically can't be a valid thing to say. Right. Okay, people. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I shall see you next time when we shall do another vegan time tunnel. Thanks very much.
We respect animals. We respect right to live. We respect. We're not animal lovers. We're not animal lovers. We're not animal lovers. We're not animal lovers. We respect animals. We respect our neighbours. We don't love our neighbours. We respect them. We respect their right to live. Right to live. We respect. We're not animal lovers. We respect. We're not animal lovers. We respect. We're not animal lovers. Right to live. We're not animal lovers. We respect animals. We respect our neighbours. We don't love our neighbours. We respect them. We respect their right to live. We're not animal lovers.
Earthlings of the world, and where else. So welcome to another vegan time tunnel with me, Roger Yates, and a noisy cat at the moment. So we'll see how that transpires. So we're putting together an archive, as people who are regular will know, of significant events and people in the history of the animal rights movement, the vegan movement, etc., etc. There's been a particular emphasis at times with the pioneers of the vegan social movement, and so that's where we're at again today. So that's a good thing. Now, let me remind everyone that that feel free to comment. We don't charge you to comment in terms of getting your views on screen, so feel free to do that. And if you tune in from anywhere else besides YouTube, you'll find that the best chat is on YouTube if you so wish to take part in it. Yes, I'm going to have cat issues today, I'm sure, but we shall see. Okay, so people, welcome to the Vegan Time Tunnel. Well, that bit worked. There's been a bit of a glitch in the system for a little while, but that seems to be okay. So yes, so Leslie Cross. Now, the first thing to say about Leslie Cross is that we're going to be going through work that was published in the very late 1940s into the early to mid 1950s. So the language is an issue. So as usual, I tend to think that, you know, we all really know that people are a product of their time, and so I tend not to kind of correct it. And so you will get man for humanity and so forth. So if that rankles a little bit, apologies for that, but it is the way that they spoke in those days. So that's just the way it is in a way. Right. Now, I tend to say, and you know, people who know me will know this, that I think Leslie Cross is one of the most significant figures in the earliest history of the vegan social movement. Now, obviously, Donald Watson is the best known of the co-founders of the social movement, but Leslie Cross had a profound effect, not least on the development of the philosophy, as we'll see. I just want to make another caveat, really, which is the fact that when I talk about the vegan social movement, I'm not saying that these are the people who were the first at anything, really, except the fact that they came together and they put together a cause, a social movement and a social movement organization, and they called it veganism. So there you are. So that's the issue. I'm never claiming that these were the first anything, really, apart from coming together to form a social movement. Now, one thing that Cross did was he pointed out in 1949, and we'll come through to this, that the Vegan Society, the social movement organization, did not have a definition of veganism. It did have a definition of the vegan diet at this stage, but he set about working on vegan philosophy in a whole series of essays in the Vegan magazine. So we're talking about pre-internet here. We're talking about the 1940s and 50s. So it was a very slow process. In some senses, they did a lot of kind of thinking aloud in the pages of their journal, The Vegan. And so it's the kind of thinking aloud from Cross and his work on the philosophy of veganism that this time tunnel's all about. There's an irony, really, because all those essays are now available on the internet, which is a bit of an irony. So if you want to see them, and in fact, you know, look at where I'm getting the material for today from, then if you went to the Candid Hominid, you'll see all the Leslie Cross materials. Now, today, I'm going to go through in some detail the search for veganism 1 and 2, as you can see there, and then also the search for freedom. So those are the areas that I'm picking out. But as you can see, there are other materials apart from that. Now, one thing which is interesting, some historians or some websites at least will say that there was a bit of a problem between Donald Watson and Leslie Cross in the sense of some form of rivalry. And so, you know, that may or may not be true. But one thing that is certain, really, is that whenever Watson talked about Cross publicly, he was full of compliments. He was very warm about him, really. And here Watson is saying, I hesitate to single out anyone, but I would say Leslie Cross and Arthur Ling must be put in the records as being the two outstanding faithful contributors to our cause. And then again, he was certainly one of the outstanding people who have served the movement, and in retirement, he went up and down the country giving his lecture, The Milk of Human Kindness, all voluntary, of course, paying his own expenses. So that's Watson talking about Cross. Now, those two quotes really allude to the fact that Watson was, that Cross, was also a pioneer in terms of bringing about plant milks and formation of Plamil, which is still ongoing. And so he references Arthur Ling, and so Cross and Ling were prime movers in bringing about plant milks into Britain, at least the first kind of commercially available ones, this kind of stuff. So although that's quite important in the history of our movement, this is not what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to concentrate on his philosophical work, really. So if you there are some accounts of the development and history of Plamil that you can find, but I won't be going through that today. Now, Elsie Shrigley, who was the subject of a time tunnel before, she was writing in The Vegan and covering the first decade here, so 44 through to 54. And she would certainly agree that Cross was a very significant figure in the history of the movement. So she says here, the Vegan Society was 10 years old in November 1954. Thus, it is now appropriate time to look back and assess its achievements and to remember the personalities who have helped its evolution. There have been non-dairy vegetarians through the centuries, for example, Socrates, but a letter written by Mr. Leslie Cross in the Vegetarian Messenger, pointing out the ethics of non-dairy vegetarianism, and the correspondence that followed during 1943, roused the conscience of some lacto-vegetarians and led to the formation of the Vegan Society. So one of the time tunnels covers all of that in great detail, because non-dairy vegetarians have been asking questions for a long time, not least from, say, the beginning of the 20th century, interrupted by the First World War, really. But I think what Shrigley is getting at here is that Leslie Cross's correspondence in the Vegetarian Messenger was the kind of final thing, really, that pushed the formation of the Vegan Society. It was kind of like, rumbling under as an issue for a lot of people. So that's one of the things about that. And also another issue is, of course, the fact that we had this refusal from the Vegetarian Society to include a non-dairy section in their organization. And of course, I've always called that a great favor that the vegetarians did for the vegans, in the sense that they essentially said, well, look, let's just, you go ahead and do your vegan stuff and we'll carry on doing vegetarianism. And so that's what happened. And that really is the reason now we have vegan philosophy as we know it. And so in that sense, it was a great success. So here's a little summary of some of the things that I've said so far, which is, this is Sam Calvert, the head of communications for the Vegan Society, and sometime I think either classified as the official historian or an unofficial historian, but she did work on the history of the vegan movement, not least this document here, which is called Ripened by Human Determination, 70 Years of the Vegan Society. And that's still online. If you go to the Vegan Society's website and look at the history section, you'll find a long document. And in that, Sam Calvert says, although the vegan diet was defined early on, it was as late as 1949 before Leslie J. Cross pointed out that the society lacked a definition of veganism. And he suggested, quote, the principle of the emancipation of animals from exploitation by man. This was later clarified as to seek an end to the use of animals by man for food, commodities, work, hunting, vivisection, and all other uses involving exploitation of animal life by man. So those were some of the early attempts. So we're going to go through that in a little bit of detail, in a sense. So we start then with this in search of veganism, and this is kind of part one for now. And this is summer 1949, and this is actually quite a modern thing to say, in the sense that there are even websites now kind of focused on the definition, basically saying that everybody seems to have their own definition of veganism, but that wasn't an ideal situation, certainly not at the beginning of the social movement. So Cross says, when we say veganism is this or that, what we are really saying is my idea of veganism is this or that. For there is nothing in the constitution of the Vegan Society which states what veganism is. And so this is the first thing that Cross points out and says, right, we've got an issue that we need to kind of sort out, if you like. And so we're kind of 5 years into the existence of the vegan social movement at this stage. And Cross actually said that there was good organizational reasons to delay the formalization of an official definition. So not having a definition thus far, as it were, wasn't a problem. In fact, it was probably a good thing, he argued. He said, but the time when it was a benefit compared with the time when it's a hindrance is coming to fruition now. And so we've got to, as it were, start working on the definition of veganism rather than just a vegan diet. And he says we're going to have to start doing it pretty soon. And that essentially is what he did from that point on. So up until at least 1954, Cross engages in an exercise of, as I said, he's basically thinking out loud through the pages of The Vegan, the magazine, and evolving ideas about vegan philosophy as the years ticked by, in a sense. Now, this is an interesting one. This essentially is almost like Cross providing a literature review of what's been done up to that date in terms of thoughts about, ideas about a definition. And so this is kind of definitional work that has been done up to 1949. But he said that there hasn't been a great deal of it, but there was some. And he said it even in the editorial of the very first Vegan News, before it was called The Vegan, stated, we can see quite plainly that our present civilization is built upon the exploitation of animals, just as past civilizations were built on the exploitation of slaves. I think it's worth pointing out, just for modern times, really, in terms of the language here, it's quite interesting in the sense that they talked about exploitation. And I know we've got exploitation of and cruelty to in the now official definition, but they didn't really go for that very much in those days. Kate J. Billy Thompson, who runs the Retreat Sanctuary, tells a lovely story about a chance encounter with Arthur Ling, who he met on a flight when they both realized each other were asking for soya milk. Right? Oh, that's interesting. In fact, I've got a time tunnel about Arthur Ling, but it's not published yet, I don't think. The interesting thing about that point, though, is the fact that one of the first things that they did as Plamil was to provide those little diddy little cartons that you got on planes, with like the the peel top kind of thing. And I remember those. I used to go to there's that famous village in Wales, Llanfair PG. It's that really long one which finishes go go gok. I'm not even going to attempt to try and say the name, but there's like a visitor centre there, and there used to be some Plamil little cartons of milks, which were a kind of hangover from those kind of days. But yeah, that's one of the first things they did. They actually started to look at things for airlines, which I suppose was quite a modern thing to do. So Cross says that this first statement from Watson was an early hint that non-dairy vegetarianism was destined to be more than just part of the general philosophy of a new movement. And so they started off as non-dairy vegetarians, and they quickly moved on, essentially. By the time we get to the third issue, which is May 1945, states that veganism was the practice of living upon fruits, nuts, vegetables, grains, and other wholesome non-animal foods. And Cross comments in the brackets, it would perhaps have been more accurate to have said not that veganism is, but that it involves living on such foods. And then he mentions the fourth issue, which is close to my heart in the sense that I still think this is probably the best statement about veganism that's ever been, really. The object of the vegan society is to oppose the exploitation of sentient life, whether it is profitable to do so or not. And Cross again comments, this is a considerable widening of the original non-dairy motivation. And so right from the start, when they were, as it were, given their head by the vegetarians, in this kind of ironic kind of way that it worked, they started moving away from just thinking about food, moving away from just non-dairy vegetarianism, and they started to think about other issues, which culminated in Cross's own work, really. So this is essentially him going through the work and the thoughts of Donald Watson, and that's before Cross takes on the work of evolving and describing vegan philosophy. Cross also notes that even when in March 1947, the Vegan Society was formed in a constitutional sense, so it gained a constitution. So even though that meant that they were starting to become more official in terms of being an organization and a social movement organization, there was still no vegan definition that had emerged at that time. So we're talking about 47, but still no sign of a vegan definition. He says that, this is an interesting observation. He says, essentially, up until then, the people in the Vegan Society were merely attempting, he says, to make their vegetarianism logical, which is an interesting phrase. Clearly, they needed a new definition. And so this is why the work had begun, that new members could consent to, and as it were able to kind of, if you like, pledge allegiance to. And so this became an urgent kind of need within the later part of the first, 10 years of the society. Cross believed that the definition needed to be in the form of a principle from which practices logically devolve. Now, this is quite an important point, and we'll see this in detail in the next few minutes. What veganism should not be seen as is it's not in the form of a set of practices. That's not what veganism is, or even aims. It's a principle. He said that they had embarked on a voyage of discovery to find the principle that is veganism, and it's not a set of practices or aims. So this is how Cross starts the second part of this essay. So this is In Search of Veganism 2. So this is autumn now of 49. And he says, this is an attempt to discover the principle whose label is veganism, and to suggest a tentative form of words which, as a short definition, closely describes it. Now, that becomes quite important in this story, but we'll leave that for now, but the short definition. It should be held in mind that the views expressed are of the writers. So Cross was saying, this is me talking, as it were, and this is not official Vegan Society stuff, as it were. So talking about the process the movement had gone through to date, Cross said that there had been an early tendency to get at the roots of the relationship between man, humanity, and the animals, the other animals. But to deal with a cause rather than almost uncountable symptoms. So this is important. He said there is no evidence that veganism was fundamentally concerned with anything other than the man plus animal relationship. And the end section here, this is Cross's emphasis. And I've kind of picked out concerned with anything other than. So this might suggest, as some people have suggested, it is true and kind of hope for, that Cross is a kind of animals only theorist, but that is not the case. The key wording here is fundamentally concerned. And in the very next sentence, he says that relationship is veganism's paramount, but not only concern. So Cross suggests that existing literature from Watson reinforces that view just expressed. And he says this, for example, he cites an address on veganism by Watson in 1947. He said, this contains phrases such as the right approach to the problem of animal emancipation, to be the true emancipators of animals. The vegan renounces the superstition that continuing human existence depends on the exploitation of these creatures, and the time has come for us boldly to renounce the idea that we have the right to exploit animals. And at the end of the paragraph, Cross writes this: the thread that runs through the literature on this point is a conviction that for the sake of both man and his fellow creatures, the animals must one day be freed from his exploitation. So this becomes a major theme for Cross and some of the early pioneers. And essentially, you could boil it down to something like, our liberation is their liberation is our liberation. So it's my contention that what we're seeing is the very first rehearsals of something that I've called the focus and the scope of veganism here. And so I'm going to try and put, excuse the phrase, try and put a bit of flesh on that now, in a sense. So Cross starts talking about what he calls observations. He said there are a number of observations that lead to the following. He said that veganism is a reform, the first observation. The impelling element, which means the driving or the urge, is compassion for other animals arising out of the treatment meted out to them by humanity. Its fundamental concern is with the meeting point between the world of man, as he put it, and the world of the animals. Its existing presupposes maladjustment at that point. So veganism, it's the existence of veganism presupposes a maladjustment at the point where we and other animals relate, if you like. Its purpose must be corrective to that maladjustment, and the maladjustment is intimately connected to man's use of animals, more precisely with his habit of acting as a parasite on living creatures who cannot successfully resist his will. So Cross argues that any definition of veganism must contain those 6 observations and also violate none of them. And that a form of words which meets the requirements is that veganism is the principle of the abolition of the exploitation of animals by man. And the positive aspect of this negative, in the word non-exploitation approach, is the granting of freedom, or he said in one word, emancipation. So moving towards the beginning of the foundation of the definition, veganism may therefore be defined as the principle of the emancipation of the animals from exploitation by man. And Cross provides some footnotes here. He says that emancipation means the state of being set free. Exploitation, the act of using for selfish purposes. And animals, sentient animate creatures other than man. But there's more from that. Maladjustment. Hi, Colleen. Well, animal, yeah, broken relationship. I suppose it is actually. That probably is a fair point, that Animal Rising are getting at that idea that we've got a broken relationship. Yeah, I think that's probably true. So there's more than just that. So this is a starting point. So we've got all those observations, then that gets boiled down to this, and then it expands back out again. So it's kind of quite interesting. Cross says that this definition meets those 6 observations, but that in itself is not enough. They must also meet the requirements of what he calls wisdom and logic. And he says that they must be measured against a general philosophical argument. And so he then comes up with this, and apologies because for some reason this hasn't come out completely fully. This is the only slide that I've got a problem with. He said the broad demand which wisdom makes upon a man is that he shall free himself of the chains which bind him to his less noble desires, and inhibit his ascent to higher standpoints, wider visions, and consequent happiness. There are a number of tests by which his efforts to free himself may be judged, and one of the most stringent is his conduct towards those over whom he has power. So this is not really unique to Cross, but it's him putting this in a vegan context. It is applied in acute form at the point where his world meets the world of the animals, for over whom he has dominion. So sorry, that's the bit that's cut off from the bottom. So he says that, okay, so this is a formulation, but then if you look at, he says, his conduct, humanity's conduct at this point, in other words, the present time, reveals tendencies which are strongly self-indulgent at the expense of the creatures. There is a widespread failure to understand that other animals have rights relatively equal to his, and that's Cross's emphasis, relatively. Yeah, that's Cross's emphasis. His exploitations result in a needless curtailment of natural freedom over a wide front, and inevitably ends in one sort of slaughterhouse or another. And again, that is Cross's emphasis again. This is true of all his exploitations, from the backyard hen to the great beef and dairy herds. And then it's interesting, he seems to go on to address an issue which was an issue of the day. He says that although some horses may end up in kind of rest homes, he said that only applies to a few. He said most are killed for commodities, feeding stuffs, or human consumption. And again, he goes back to worn out cows from the dairy herds. They're not pensioned off in clover fields. And so he just makes that kind of point, which is obviously addressing some issue that was a burning issue of the day. Now, this passage then reveals a theme that Cross would fully develop in later essays, because both he and Donald Watson expected veganism to do a lot of work for humans as well as for other animals. Watson went on to declare that veganism was the only movement that was capable of saving humanity. And Cross's work was replete with lines such as, quote, because he would free himself from many of the demands made by his lower nature, the benefit of veganism to man himself would be incalculable. So if you look at Cross's work, then that kind of phraseology is used all the time. So this really is the beginning of Leslie Cross's thoughts about the moral evolution of humanity. And they would start to argue that human beings, and this is probably the result of two global conflicts in short order, have kind of hit a new low, which historically I think is arguable, but that's where they was. And they thought that we need to evolve morally to get ourselves out of some kind of, moral trough, if you like. And that was summed up quite nicely in the Kathleen Janaway time tunnel, where she was saying, can we do it, or are we capable of doing it? And so they were all kind of on that kind of same theme, really, that they needed to see the moral evolution of humanity. And so he writes, because emancipation would at one and the same moment release the animals from bondage and man from being their parasite, because of putting it into effect, man would free himself from some of the chains which bind him to his less noble desires. It fulfills the demands of wisdom as well as logic. And so he's saying now we're getting a situation where it's kind of all coming together. We've, as it were, got a real focus, and then we've also got the aspects of the scope which kind of point towards wider things, if you like. Okay, so finally, on this rather detailed rundown of those two first essays, there's also another 3 further striking indications, as he calls them, that this is so. In other words, that this fulfills the demands of wisdom as well as logic. The first 2, he says, emerge from a broad view of the general trend of human evolution. A movement to emancipate animals may be seen to be following naturally and historically upon the movement to emancipate human slaves, which is also what Watson said in the very first vegan news. It thus possesses the aesthetic and significant attribute of evolutionary continuity. Second, it is far from being outside the bounds of probability. It's likely, in other words, that a wrong turning has been taken by humanity somewhere in his evolution. And that wrong turning was the enslavement, the so-called domestication, or what Niebuhr calls the domestication of other animals. And he says this is a proposition abundantly argued by American writer Henry Bailey Stevens. There is a reference to that in the essay if you want to check it. Thirdly, emancipation goes straight to the cancer at the heart of the existing man-animal relationship, and as Colleen is saying, the broken relationship that Animal Rising talk about, and would remove at one stroke the single cause from which all the sorry symptoms arise. There's quite a lot, even right into the 1960s, of claims which are very much like this. The kind of sorry state of the world, and that what we need is veganism, and that almost in terms of it's kind of cultural promise would be a really kind of good thing to happen. And so even beyond people like Watson and Cross, people like Sanderson, for example, right into the 1960s, these kind of phrases were used. So now that just really is the first two essays, where he starts to really work on the intricate details of vegan philosophy. And so time won't allow me to go through each and every essay in that kind of detail. So that's the search for veganism 1 and 2. But I do want to talk about this one in particular. So this is at the end of this process, 1954. So it deserves some attention for that. I think the first thing to say really is that they don't write in sound bites. And so this kind of idea of, you know, making it kind of available for Twitter is not really on with the way that they wrote. They wrote full-scale essays, and in the vegan, you know, you might have full pages, you know, 4 pages to comprise one essay. And so, you know, it's important for people to get a real understanding of their position is to read all of what they said. And sometimes because it's, again, not sound bites, you might have to read it more than once. I certainly have in that sense. Now, the first sentence is very significant. Going back to what was said before about this short definition, he said, this is an attempt to state in simple terms what veganism is and why and how it came into existence, and to suggest what it could mean for mankind. Now it's interesting, this, because if you think in terms of what I call the focus and scope, usually what they do is they talk about the focus first, and then they talk about the scope. In this essay, which is the last one of this little series, he talks about the scope first. And in some senses, I mean, I'm not calling it a brave thing to do, but he's certainly not afraid to go for the scope first. And then, of course, he then starts talking about the focus. It's just, again, they expected all of their words to be, you know, to be read, really. And so it didn't really matter where they began in terms of focus and scope. So usually it was focus first. On this occasion, it's kind of focus first. Plain speaking is always best on a subject like this. John, excellent. I am pleased to see you here. So John Cross, for people who don't know, and certainly people who might be watching the recording, is Leslie Cross's son. Has been vegan for 80 years. And so welcome along, John. You're more than welcome here. And so Leslie Cross goes on to say, the word veganism is a symbol that stands for a major change, a new mutation comparable to the freeing of the serfs and the freeing of the slaves. So again, that kind of rehearsal of those kind of points that was said by Watson in 44 and repeated by a lot of people right up until the 60s, really. And then its official definition, the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals, is accurate, precise, and comprehensive, but not always fully understood. And he goes, this is not surprising. Now, I take this to mean that even though they took all those kind of observations and they boiled it all down to this very short definition, which ended up being, you know, 9 or 10 words, he's basically saying that, you know, that's just the beginning of our adventures into veganism. The definition itself can only be seen as the beginning of, you know, an entry point into understanding veganism. It's certainly not the be end and end all. So he says, this is not surprising, as it might seem, for rarely have 9 short words enshrined a reform so massive, the achievement of which would bring a new world and new men to inhabit it. So again, all those kind of themes coming together, but basically trying to suggest really that that even though they've condensed it down, in a sense, you need then to expand it back out again to kind of gain a full understanding of veganism. Okay, so here's a few more thoughts from this essay, The Surge of Freedom. As I said, it's in Candid Hominid if you want to read the entire thing. I think what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to put it on full screen so you can probably see it a little bit better. Why do we believe we should live without exploiting animals? To put the question in another form, why was such a doctrine formulated? The final, if not the immediate answer, is a revealing one, for it demonstrates the truth of the claim that veganism is not a mere side shoot in human evolution, but a central extending growth of considerable significance. So as you can see, the claims here are very wide ranging and fairly profound. Veganism owes its birth to the fact that at its deepest point within us, we believe impregnably in freedom, particularly perhaps those who were born and bred in these traditionally freedom-loving islands. So I think we could probably forgive him for a little bit of jingoism there, but we can maybe bracket that out a little bit in the 21st century. Freedom to live our own lives in our way, according to our own inward light, is fundamental to our view of life itself. It is in the light of this concept that we find the true significance of the vegan reform. Only when we see it as a doctrine, not of restriction, as those who oppose it mistakenly believe, and as we all know, they still do, but of freedom, do we fully comprehend it. And so there's obviously modern day kind of articulations of this kind of idea, veganism is not a sacrifice, it's a joy, those kind of ideas. Until the advent of veganism, comparatively few men regarded the animals as being either worthy of or entitled to the right to be free. And probably fewer still realized the impressive effect which the granting of such a right would have upon the freedom of man himself. Now, this actually deserves a little bit of chat, really, about Tom Reagan. This was written before the Case for Animal Rights, and probably written before there was a full understanding of the difference between moral rights and legal rights. And so what we would see nowadays is that other animals have moral rights. The granting of rights, if it's to happen, will be legal rights. So that's kind of worth pointing out, just for the fact that it's kind of like not Leslie Cross's fault that, he's writing this, decades before Tom Reagan. And so it's just an interesting thing to point out. When veganism reaches such a stage, there will be an immense change of heart and mind in the majority of men and women. The idea of exploiting animals will be as repugnant then as the idea of human slavery is today. Now, this is where, and he's done this in maybe 2, maybe even 3 different essays. He talks about the obvious and the not so obvious. So I've always said, in terms of focus and scope, that the obvious things are related to the focus of veganism, and the not so obvious things are related to the scope of veganism. So some of the changes in daily living are obvious, and some of this is really kind of modern sounding. There will, for example, be no butcher's shops, and the milkman, if he still goes his rounds, will be delivering vegan milk, which of course he had an involvement in. The countryside will not be heavy with the anguish of cows crying for their calves. That sounds a very modern claim. There will be no slaughterhouses, no vivisection laboratories. No one will hunt animals for fun. And then those from the obvious goes to the not so obvious. But some of the changes are not so obvious. The benefit to man himself of living in a kindlier and more enlightened world can be envisaged only in the broadest outline. His health, physical and mental, will be vastly improved. That was an interesting theme that they developed quite a lot, that they expected the benefits of veganism to be both physical and mental, almost a kind of releasing human beings from the burden of the savagery that they've kind of got involved in a sense. Will be vastly improved because he will have shared a great deal of the coarser part of his nature. Benefits of the spirit will shower upon him, benefits which today, by his own short-sighted volition, he denies himself. Now, this is a really interesting part. I love the end of this. Such is the stuff of dreams. To make them true requires that we play our part when it comes to us. So that's Ronnie Lee's plea for activism. We are in the very elementary stage of the new mutation. We are the pioneers. And it's really interesting because I used to do a talk about 10 years ago saying that we are still really, vegan pioneers, that our movement is not so old and not so well established. And it was only really then just kind of taking off. And as social movement theory suggests, it's taken off in the kind of problematic way that movements do take off. In fact, that a lot of people come in, a lot of them don't have the same values of the people who started it. That kind of creates problems. There's a push toward professionalization, all those kind of things. But that is all kind of part and parcel of the deal. Okay, so right. So this is Catherine Janaway and her tribute to Leslie Cross in 1980. So Leslie Cross, vegan for 35 years, founder member of the Vegan Society and of the Plamil Society, died peacefully in his sleep on the 2nd of December, 1979. Inspired by his deep love for all life, he looked forward to the day when plant milks would be generally used and a great burden thus lifted from the gentle cow. He was managing director of Plamil Limited when it was at Langley Bucks, was secretary of the Plant Milk Society until his death, and often used his skills as a journalist to write on behalf of animals. And of course, I suppose we've seen those skills, his journalistic skills in his writing already. We offer our sympathies, etc., 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 and a mention of son and daughter, John. So there as well. Okay, so we're getting obviously near the end. So we are talking about a very significant player in terms of the beginning of the Vegan Society, the beginning of plant milks, but also, and this is the most significant contribution, I believe, this evolution of vegan philosophy as we know it today. And I say that with some trepidation, really, because this philosophy that we've just looked at is actually under threat at the present day. A lot of people don't like it. They think it's too wide. They think it's too radical. They think it's too revolutionary. They want to slim it down. There are a lot of reducitarian strands in the modern movement who want to reduce veganism to other animals only, or they want to reduce veganism to a diet, and in various ways slim down the meaning. There are some people in the modern movement who even really want to redefine veganism as vegetarianism or pescatarianism even, or even allowing for the consumption of some animal flesh and still be vegan, on the grounds that such a veganism would be bigger than real veganism, essentially. So that's kind of what's going on. Now, I wanted to include this because I think a lot of people will really kind of resonate with this sentiment from Leslie Cross. He's basically saying he's looking forward to, the coming of the vegan world, but also what issues that itself might bring. Again, I'll go full screen on this. As the idea becomes more and more accepted, opportunities will grow to make the path easier and more attractive for those whose nature is not that of the pioneer. So that's a really interesting thing, that the idea that, some people are going to put themselves out rather more for a cause than others. And so the easier it gets, the more we might expect people to join in a way. There are some dangers in that kind of idea, but you can understand where it comes from. Concurrent with the gradual removal of obstacles to the personal practice, attention will have to be given to the question of how we proceed to deal with animals in general, as soon as the changeover from exploitation to freedom reaches a certain stage. It is not difficult to see that such a changeover will bring with it problems of a wide and general character. No one, least of all the vegans, wants a world without animals. This is very evocative of Tom Reagan and the idea that we need people of goodwill to come together at this stage to figure out ways of doing things, vertical farming, what about crop deaths, all those kind of things. But also these two things that non-vegans often say to us. First of all, we'll cause the extinction of millions and billions of other animals. At the same time, they're going to overcrowd us and take over the world, or this kind of thing. So these are kind of issues that he had in mind, and how in general and how in detail we propose to affect the swing over from exploitation to perversion of freedom and naturalness to be I'm not quite sure what he's getting at there, to be quite a talking point one fine day. And then, if I may intrude a personal observation, there is little more desirable, I would ask, of Providence that and that such day I should dawn while I am still here to experience it. How glorious, for example, to take part in the discussion to decide whether, for the purposes of the changeover, a nature park or an animal sanctuary should be set up in this or that part of the country, and exactly how it should be planned. Okay, apologies for rather butchering that end bit there, but I thought it was really kind of nice to finish with that this kind of speculation of what would happen as we get nearer and nearer to a vegan world. We've probably all had these kind of thoughts, about what it would be, and these recognitions that it's going to bring some problems, and so we would need some kind of some people to come together. It's interesting, really, because there is a group doing kind of TikTok panels, and often farmers will join, and at first they'll be a little bit I'm not so sure about this, but then when we start talking about vertical farming, the future, about things like crop deaths, this kind of stuff, they become kind of on board, especially when they realize that subsidies will sort out the financial part of it, if you like. Okay, and finally then, this is Nicole L. Cross, no relation, and Louis Torres. And this is, I think it's a Spanish document, but if you go to it, if you put in those three names, Nicole L. Cross, Torres, and Leslie Cross, you'll get it. And there's one of those things where you can click and it translates it into English should you need it. And so this is, they finished their article in which actually they do interview John. So that's quite interesting. So Leslie J. Cross, no doubt, guided the concept of veganism as a matter of rights after it began to be described as a set of practices. And so that is a tension there, that this set of practices had to be critiqued and replaced with a principle. Leslie addressed the definition of veganism as an ethical principle, that is, a question based on moral rights, from which practices consistent with that principle are obviously derived. This is what he explained in the definition at the World Forum of 1951. It is important to note that one of the results of this definition is that it makes veganism a principle. That is, of course, a principle from which certain practices flow naturally, but it is itself a principle and not a set of practices. And as we've seen in terms of the evolution of vegan philosophy, that was a real kind of big theme that Leslie Cross wanted to kind of emphasize over and over, that we're talking about a philosophical stance from which, it's like when people say, well, veganism is a diet. Well, no, veganism has a dietary component which is quite large, but the diet always follows the philosophy. It's always driven by the demands of the philosophy. And so, so that's the kind of thing which is even enshrined, if you like, in the modern day weaker definition from the Vegan Society, 79 through to 88, where they kind of said, you know, in dietary terms. So they're basically saying, well, you know, you can, it's almost like a searchlight. You know, veganism is a principled searchlight which you can direct to various things. So that's the way I think that they were getting at it. So Andy, in the background, have I missed anything? Is there anything that needs to come up in the chat which I've missed? This has been a great episode. Yeah, sorry about my reading. I did mess that up a little bit. John, you must be so proud of your dad's great legacy. Yeah. The great thing about it is that for the next, I think it's next couple of months, VegFest UK, they have an online magazine called Forza Magazine. I think there's 4 or 5 of them out now, and I'm going to interview John for that mag for the next one. So really looking forward to that, and it'd be great to talk about John, obviously in his own right as a vegan of 80 years, all the changes, you know, the traditional question you get, of course, all the changes you've seen, you know, and all that, but also, you know, memories of his father and this kind of thing. Okay, people. So if we're done, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks once more to John Cross for attending, because that means a lot. So, okay, people, I'll see you next time for another Vegan Time Tunnel. Take care for now.